Vast landscapes don't become dangerous because they're wild. They become dangerous when the rules of detection fail, when fog erases distance, when storm noise masks movement, when a single food scent drifts like a signal flare. In those conditions, risk is revealed in seconds, often before a person understands what they're looking at. In this documentary, we'll examine 6 real-world style survival accounts of wildlife encounters, each broken down clearly with practical lessons about what drew the animal in, what limited the human's options, and what decisions could have changed the outcome. The northern edge of a high desert plateau in early spring can feel empty in a way that tricks people into relaxing. Here, the ground rises into broken basalt ridges and shallow ravines filled with sage and rabbit brush. A 2-lane highway cuts across the open plain, then disappears into a long corridor of low hills where cell coverage comes and goes. It was 5:18 a.m. when the first headlamps swept across a gravel turnout. The temperature sat at 2 degrees Celsius, cold enough to keep breath visible, warm enough that yesterday's snowmelt had turned the shoulder into slick mud. Thin fog lay in bands across the dips in the terrain, creating pockets where visibility dropped from 80 meters to less than 15. 2 maintenance technicians, Noah Mercer, 44, and Priya Desai, 33, were there to inspect a remote communications repeater on the ridgeline. A windstorm the previous evening had triggered intermittent outages, and their employer needed confirmation that the generator housing and antenna cables hadn't been damaged. They wore hard hats and reflective jackets, carried tool bags, and had a pickup outfitted with a roof beacon, a first aid kit, and a satellite messenger used mostly for check-ins. The animal presence wasn't the reason for the trip, but the location guaranteed it. A mountain lion corridor ran through the ravines below the ridge, used most heavily during dawn movement when prey animals traveled between cover and open feeding areas. In the weeks after winter, adult cats often widened their range, hunting longer hours as the landscape shifted and old trails softened. What mattered most was what Noah and Priya didn't notice at first: the smell. In the truck bed, sealed inside a plastic bin, was a bag of jerky and a pouch of tuna Noah had brought for the drive. The lid had been latched, but not fully snapped on one corner, leaving a thin gap. In still air, that's nothing. In fog that sits low and traps odor, it can become an invisible beacon. By 5:41 a.m., they were halfway up the service track, the repeater tower a darker silhouette against a gray sky. The wind had dropped, and the silence felt complete. No birds, no traffic noise, just the crunch of boots on gritty snow. Priya reached the padlock on the generator cage. Noah set his tool bag down and turned to the pickup to grab a replacement fuse. His back was to the ravine for less than 10 seconds. That was enough. The cat did not announce itself with a growl. It appeared as a shape that resolved too late, tawny, low, moving fast through the fog line, then stopping abruptly at the edge of the gravel. Later estimates put it at roughly 60 to 70 kilograms, a large adult with the compact, balanced posture of an animal used to controlling distance. Noah saw it first, not because it was loud, but because the fog shifted and briefly outlined its head and shoulders. He froze mid-step. Priya looked up, following the change in his posture. The mountain lion didn't charge immediately. It circled wider than expected, testing angles. Its attention kept flicking toward the truck bed, then back to the humans, as if weighing which movement mattered most. Noah did what many people do under surprise. He stepped backward, trying to reach the truck cab. The motion triggered the cat's decision. It accelerated in a sudden burst, closing the gap in 2 bounds. Priya reacted with the only tool in her hands, the heavy steel flashlight she used for inspection work. She turned toward the oncoming animal and raised it high, making herself taller. Noah shouted, not words so much as a sustained, forceful noise. The cat veered. It did not collide with them. Instead, it leapt onto the pickup bed, claws scraping painted metal with a sound like tearing fabric. Close up, claw tips skating across wet steel. The lid of the bin shifted under its weight. The cat's head dropped, sniffing. Focused. Noah hit the truck's panic horn. The electronic alarm echoed off the ridge. Priya swung the flashlight hard against the side of the bed, metallic clanging, bright, sharp. The cat flinched but didn't leave. It looked back toward them with ears forward, not flattened, curious, assessing. The standoff lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt longer because nothing changed fast. Then Noah did something that altered the pattern. He opened the driver door wide and used it like a moving barrier, stepping out and slamming it once, twice, building a rhythm of noise and motion that pushed the cat's attention away from the food. On the third slam, the lion jumped down, landed silently, and melted into the fog along the ravine edge. It didn't run. It simply withdrew, as if it had learned enough. They didn't chase it. They didn't win. They gathered their equipment and returned to the turnout, hands shaking in the quiet after the horn died. Noah had shallow scratches across his right forearm from the bin lid snapping back when he tried to relatch it. Priya's injury was less visible, a sprained wrist from the force of striking metal at an awkward angle. They finished the inspection later that morning with a third co-worker present and the truck bed cleared of all scented items. Officials reviewing the incident emphasized how quickly a small oversight, an imperfect seal on food storage, combined with fog and dawn timing to create a close encounter. The lion's behavior suggested investigation more than predation, but the approach path and circling pattern showed how little warning a person can expect when visibility collapses. Key takeaway: in low visibility, even sealed food can act as an attractant. Store scent items in hard-sided containers with verified closures and never turn your back to likely travel corridors. A ridge can look controlled because it has a tower and a service road, but animals don't recognize infrastructure as safety. In the next account, the setting is built for people, yet one missing layer of separation turns a routine task into a timed escape. The edge of a coastal city often hides a different kind of wild. A wastewater treatment facility sits where the river meets salt marsh, surrounded by chain-link fences, floodlights, and concrete settling pools that steam faintly in cold months. Beyond the perimeter, reeds and mudflats stretch out, and the tide makes its own schedule. At 9:12 p.m. in late November, the air temperature was 4 degrees Celsius, and a steady drizzle had been falling long enough to turn the ground into reflective black glass. The facility's night shift was thin, 2 operators in the control room and 1 security guard doing rounds in a small electric cart. Marisol Vega, 29, had been called in as an on-site contractor to check a failing sensor at the far end of the property. It was a simple job. Replace a corroded connector, confirm the readout, leave. She carried a compact toolkit and wore a rain shell over insulated work clothes. The guard, Dominic Pruitt, 52, accompanied her. Standard policy for after-hours access to restricted zones. The environment around the plant attracted predators in predictable ways. Rodents fed on waste and grain from nearby shipping yards. Waterfowl rested on the marsh. Where prey concentrates, opportunists follow. In this region, the most common were coyotes, but a larger animal had been reported that month by staff, an adult black bear that had learned to forage along the river, especially after garbage pickup days. The trigger was smell and timing. A dumpster behind the maintenance shed had been overfilled after a weekend event at a nearby park. The lid sat tilted, rainwater pooling in the gap, releasing a steady odor of food waste into cold air that held scent close to the ground. By 9:27 p.m., Marisol and Dominic reached the sensor station, a narrow walkway along a concrete channel guarded by a waist-high railing. Floodlights lit the area in hard white cones, but shadows pooled between them. The drizzle hissed on warm machinery, and the background noise of pumps masked anything quieter. Marisol knelt to open the access panel. Dominic stood a few meters back, watching the perimeter fence line more out of habit than expectation. Beyond the fence, reeds moved in the wind. A heavy sound, more felt than heard, came from the direction of the dumpster area. Dominic turned his head. Marisol kept working, focused on the connector in her gloved hands. The bear entered the light like a piece of the dark becoming solid. It was not enormous by northern standards, but large enough to matter, roughly 140 to 180 kilograms, broad-shouldered, wet fur clinging to its body. It moved with confidence, head low, tracking scent. The animal didn't charge. It walked directly toward the maintenance shed, then paused as it noticed the 2 humans on the walkway. Its nose lifted, water dripped from its muzzle. Dominic raised his voice and clapped once hard. The bear stopped, looked, and took 2 slow steps closer. Marisol stood and backed toward the control gate. She reached for her radio, but the static in her earpiece reminded her that this corner of the property always had interference from the motors. The bear shifted from curiosity to intent when it caught the wind from the dumpster. It turned its head away from the humans, then began moving toward the shed with renewed focus. That should have been relief. Instead, it created a new danger. The bear's path crossed the narrow exit route they needed to leave the walkway. Dominic did the one thing he had that could change the geometry of the situation. He drove the electric cart forward, putting the vehicle between the bear and the walkway gate, then hit the horn. The sound was thin compared to a truck horn, but in the empty facility, it carried. The bear startled, stepping sideways. Marisol used the moment to move fast. No running, just deliberate speed to the gate latch. Wide shot, rain streaking through floodlight cones, a narrow walkway with only one exit. The latch stuck. Cold metal, wet gloves, poor grip. Dominic kept the cart moving in short arcs, not toward the bear, but across its line of travel, forcing it to track the vehicle rather than the humans. The bear huffed and swatted once, more a warning strike than an attack, its paw glancing off the cart's plastic side panel with a dull crack. Marisol got the gate open and slipped through. Dominic reversed hard, the cartwheels spinning on wet concrete, then followed her through the opening, just as the bear stepped forward again. They reached the control room at 9:34 p.m., breath loud in their ears. The bear remained in the yard for another 15 minutes, investigating the dumpster and pawing at the shed door. It left when a facility supervisor arrived with a full-sized pickup and activated the vehicle's alarm and headlights in repeated bursts, increasing noise and light until the bear finally moved back toward the river. Marisol wasn't physically injured, but she reported trembling hands for hours. The delayed shock of realizing how quickly a simple exit route became a trap. Dominic had bruising on his shoulder from the cart's abrupt turn and a deep scratch on his forearm from the gate latch. In the follow-up, the facility replaced dumpsters with bear-resistant units, installed improved fencing skirts at known entry points, and changed policy. No lone work beyond the main building at night without a vehicle capable of loud deterrence and immediate retreat. Key takeaway: in built environments, animals still move toward attractants, secure waste, and never assume fences and lights replace a clear escape route. A marsh can hide predators the way fog hides mountains, by making everything feel distant until it isn't. The next story happens at elevation, where thin air and mechanical noise create their own blindfold. A midwinter ski area runs on rhythm, lifts turning, snowcats grooming, generators humming behind maintenance buildings. At 6:06 a.m., long before the first guests arrive, the mountain belongs to workers and the wind. The resort sat high in a conifer basin, and that morning the temperature was minus 14 degrees Celsius. A light snow fell straight down, no wind, the kind that muffles everything. Floodlights illuminated the base area in pale circles, while the tree line remained a dark wall beyond the last parked shuttle bus. Ethan Klein, 37, was part of the snowmaking crew. His job was to check a valve station near the lower tree line and confirm that a pressure drop recorded overnight wasn't a line freeze. He moved alone, as crews sometimes do when the task is short. He carried a radio, a headlamp, and a metal spanner that fit the valve assembly. Wildlife presence around ski resorts is common. Deer browse on landscaped edges. Small predators follow. In this region, cougars were rare but present, and black bears sometimes wandered through during warmer spells. But this morning's risk factor wasn't a bear or a cat. It was a pack of wolves that had been tracking a weak elk herd down the drainage for weeks, using the resort's groomed corridors as efficient travel routes. The vulnerability was sound. Snow guns and compressors masked footfalls. The snow itself absorbed noise. Ethan's headlamp narrowed his attention into a tunnel. At 6:19 a.m., he reached the valve station, a metal box half buried in snow beside a service road. He knelt, brushed ice away, and felt the casing with his gloved hand. The metal burned cold. He didn't see the first wolf. He heard it, a soft single exhale from the darkness at the edge of his light. When he looked up, there were two shapes, then three, moving in and out of the beam, not charging, but stepping with intention. The wolves were not huge, roughly 35 to 45 kilograms each, but their presence as a group changed every calculation. They held distance at first, circling wide, testing his reactions. Their ears were forward. Their tails were neutral, not panicked, not fleeing. Ethan stood slowly, making himself tall, and backed toward the open service road where he had more room. His radio crackled uselessly. The mountain's early morning interference was always worst in this drainage. The trigger arrived in the form of another animal, unseen. A faint squeal, brief, high, distressed, came from deeper in the trees. It sounded like a small prey animal caught or cornered. The wolves' focus tightened instantly. Two of them stopped tracking Ethan and oriented toward the sound, then reoriented back to him as he moved. That was the moment the pack's behavior shifted from curious to opportunistic. One wolf stepped forward quickly, snapping once. Not a full bite, but a test aimed at his boot. Ethan jerked his foot back. The wolf retreated a step, then advanced again. Ethan used the only deterrence in his hands. He struck the metal spanner against the valve box, producing a sharp ringing sound that carried in the cold air. Close up, metal-on-metal impact, frost dust shaking off the casing. He repeated it, louder, then shouted in a deep voice, steady rather than frantic. The pack paused, not retreating, but recalculating. Ethan took advantage of the pause to create space, moving backward down the service road toward the base area's brighter lights. The wolves followed at a measured pace, staying just outside arm's reach, as if waiting for a stumble. At 6:23 a.m., Ethan's heel caught a ridge of packed snow, an uneven groom line where the snowcat had turned. He didn't fall fully, but his balance broke. That was enough for a second wolf to dart in and snap at his calf. The bite connected through his snow pants, leaving a bruised puncture that would later swell. Ethan pivoted, swinging the spanner in a wide arc, not aiming to hit, but to claim space. The wolf flinched back. He did it again, then back toward a snowmobile parked near the lift shack. He reached it in seconds that felt like minutes. He slammed the starter. The engine coughed, then turned over with a loud mechanical roar. Sudden sound in a muffled world. The wolves stopped immediately. Two turned away. The rest held position, watching the machine. Ethan kept the engine revving and drove slowly toward the base area, not fast enough to crash, fast enough to communicate dominance. By the time he reached the main lot lights, the pack had melted into the trees, leaving only tracks that braided through the fresh snow. He was treated at the resort clinic within 20 minutes, one puncture wound, bruising, and a strained wrist from gripping the spanner too tightly during the retreat. The deeper effect was psychological. His report mentioned a lingering awareness of being followed for days, even in crowded spaces. Officials later concluded that the pack was likely in active hunting mode, using the resort corridors to move efficiently. Ethan's lone presence, headlamp tunnel vision, and the muffling effect of snowmaking noise removed early warning and increased his vulnerability. The resort added policy changes, two-person checks in low-light tree-line zones, additional lighting at valve stations, and mandatory carry of an air horn in winter. Key takeaway: predators don't need to attack to be dangerous. Being shadowed in silence is a risk signal, and noise plus movement toward brighter zones can break pursuit behavior. The mountain's noise hid the wolves. In the next story, the opposite happens. Silence is the problem, and a still lake turns scent into a corridor that leads straight to a tent. In late summer, a boreal lake can look forgiving. Calm water, long daylight, soft moss underfoot. But isolation changes the cost of mistakes. The nearest road was 27 kilometers away by rough portage, and the only way in was by canoe and patience. At 8:37 p.m., the temperature had dropped to 9 degrees Celsius. The sky was clear, and the lake reflected the first stars. In the tree line, mosquitoes thinned as the air cooled, and the forest went quiet in the way it does right before night fully settles. Two friends, Hana Sado, 28, and Marcus Hill, 31, had set up a small camp on a flat patch near the shoreline. They were experienced weekend paddlers, not survival specialists, competent, organized, confident in the basics. Their plan was simple: one night at the lake, then back out at first light. The animal context was classic for the season. A young grizzly, likely recently independent, had been ranging near the water, feeding on berries and scavenging along the shore. Late summer is a time of constant intake, when bears build reserves for the coming months. Young animals in particular can be bold, testing boundaries because they haven't been punished by experience yet. The vulnerability detail arrived in the form of convenience. Hana and Marcus cooked fish over a small stove near the tent, then rinsed the pan at the shoreline. They bagged the fish scraps, but instead of hanging them or packing them away in a hard container, they left the sealed bag inside a soft cooler just for the night, believing the cold air would reduce odor. At 9:22 p.m., they zipped the tent, turned off their headlamps, and let the forest fill the gaps in sound. At 11:58 p.m., Marcus woke to a subtle vibration in the ground, the kind that registers before the brain identifies the source. He heard breathing outside the tent, slow and heavy. The nylon wall bowed inward slightly, then released. Hana whispered his name. He didn't answer at first, listening. A low huff, then the soft scrape of claws against something plastic. The bear did not tear into the tent immediately. It worked methodically, following scent. The soft cooler was only 3 meters away, placed beside a stump. The bear's muzzle pushed against it, and the cooler slid across the moss with a muted sound. Marcus reached for his headlamp and clicked it on. The sudden beam turned the tent interior white and revealed Hana's wide eyes. He then angled the light toward the tent wall, illuminating a shadow that moved past. Large, close, unmistakable. They didn't have a firearm. They did have a bear spray canister stored in the tent's side pocket and an air horn attached to Marcus's pack strap. Marcus unzipped the tent door 2 inches, just enough to see. The bear was there, broad-backed, head down over the cooler. It looked around 200 to 250 kilograms, not enormous, but heavy and strong in the way young grizzlies can be. The trigger came when Hana shifted behind him, the sound of nylon and a quick inhale. The bear's head snapped up toward the tent. Attention now on the humans. Marcus didn't wait. He blasted the air horn once. The sound was explosive in the quiet night. The bear jerked back, then stepped forward again, agitated. He followed with the bear spray, but he did not spray blindly. He opened the tent flap wider, aimed low, and released a controlled burst toward the bear's face at close range. The bear recoiled, shaking its head, then spun away toward the shoreline. The sound of its movement was abrupt, branches cracking, water splashing as it ran through the shallows and into the darkness. Hana and Marcus stayed awake until morning, sitting back to back inside the tent with headlamps on low and the horn ready. They packed at first light, leaving the site at 5:12 a.m., moving quickly but calmly, scanning constantly. Neither suffered a physical injury. The cooler did not survive, punctured and torn. The bigger damage was in the realization that a sealed bag inside soft storage can still attract a bear, and that a quiet lake at night amplifies every mistake. In the aftermath, park staff who reviewed their report highlighted 3 factors: food odor management failure, proximity of cooking area to sleeping area, and the absence of a rigid bear-resistant container in a known bear corridor. They recommended a standard triangle setup: cook site, food storage, and sleeping area separated by at least 50 meters where terrain allows. Key takeaway: soft storage and short distances feel convenient, but in bear country, convenience becomes a scent trail. Separate sleeping and cooking zones, and use rigid verified food protection. A calm night can be deceptive because it offers no warning sounds. The next story takes place in a louder world, an urban edge where human noise is constant, and that constant noise makes a large animal's approach feel impossible right up until it happens. The greenbelt along a suburban river is threaded with paved paths, dog parks, and wooden footbridges that look like safety. On weekends, it's crowded. On weekday mornings, it belongs to joggers, commuters, and people who assume the city has replaced the wild. At 6:44 a.m. in early October, the temperature was 11 degrees Celsius. A thin ground fog sat over the river, and the streetlights were still on, reflecting in damp leaves. Traffic noise from a nearby arterial road created a steady hum that made smaller sounds irrelevant. Dylan Cho, 34, was walking his dog, a 4-year-old shepherd mix named Coda. He had lived in the area for 2 years and took the same route most mornings. Coda was on a leash, but a long one, 3 meters, allowing the dog to sniff the edges of the trail. The animal context here wasn't a bear. It was a big cat, specifically a cougar that had been pushed closer to the greenbelt by recent construction deeper in the hills. Wildlife officers later described it as a mature female, likely 45 to 55 kilograms, using the river corridor to move between patches of cover. The vulnerability detail was simple: the fog and the noise. Fog reduced sight lines to 20 meters. Traffic masked the subtle sounds of movement in brush. Dylan's attention stayed on the path ahead, not on the reeds and willow thickets where a cat could travel unseen. At 6:52 a.m., Coda stiffened and stared toward the tree line. Dylan followed the dog's gaze and saw nothing, just gray and the suggestion of branches. He shortened the leash and continued, assuming it was a rabbit. The trigger occurred when Coda barked once, sharp, loud. That sound in a corridor used by a hunting cat can shift an animal from stealth to action. The cougar, which had likely been tracking from cover, broke concealment. It emerged at the edge of the path in a low sprint, not aiming at Dylan but at the dog. The movement was so fast it looked like a shadow detaching from fog. Dylan pulled Coda toward him. The cougar reached them anyway, launching toward the dog's shoulder. The leash went taut. Dylan fell backward onto wet leaves, landing hard on his hip. The attack beat was short and brutal in its simplicity. The cougar bit, then released, then tried again, searching for control. Coda yelped and twisted, paws scrabbling on the slick trail surface. Dylan's response was improvised and immediate. He screamed, not a word, but a sustained, forceful sound, and kicked toward the cat's flank while pulling the leash close, trying to get Coda behind him. A cyclist rounded the bend at that exact moment, headlight beams slicing through fog. The rider shouted and braked hard, tires skidding. The sudden light and second human presence changed the cat's risk calculation. Dylan grabbed a fist-sized rock from the trail edge and threw it. It didn't have to hit. It had to move through the cougar's space. The cougar released Coda and backed into the brush, tail low, eyes locked for a final second. Then it vanished into the fog as if the landscape had swallowed it. Coda was bleeding from 2 punctures on the shoulder and a torn ear. Dylan had a bruised hip and scraped hands from the fall. Emergency veterinary care began within an hour, and Coda recovered fully after stitches and antibiotics. Dylan's physical injuries healed faster than his nervous system. He reported scanning every tree line for weeks and avoiding the trail until winter, when visibility improved. Officials later cited a common urban edge pattern, construction displacement, prey concentration along greenbelts, and the way noise pollution removes a person's ability to hear approach. They recommended shorter leashes during low visibility, avoiding dawn and dusk in known corridors, and carrying a loud deterrent like an air horn when walking dogs near dense cover. Key takeaway: in urban edge corridors, fog and traffic noise can hide a predator's approach. Keep dogs close, avoid low visibility hours, and use loud deterrents to break a cat's commitment. A city's hum can be as blinding as a snowstorm. The final story returns to true isolation, where rescue time becomes a factor of weather, and one decision about storage determines whether a cabin is shelter or bait. A research cabin in the far north is built to hold heat, not to resist force. It sits where the tree line thins and the ground becomes a mix of scrub, rock, and wind-shaped snow. In January, the landscape is a palette of gray and white, and distance is hard to judge even on clear days. At 3:11 a.m., the temperature outside was minus 27 degrees Celsius. Wind gusts reached 55 kilometers per hour, driving snow sideways so that the cabin windows became opaque sheets of ice. The generator ran in a steady, low thrum that made the world feel mechanically sealed. Inside were 2 people, field biologist Amira Nassar, 39, and logistics coordinator Cole Bennett, 42. They were there to maintain remote camera traps and download data on winter ungulate movement. The cabin was their midpoint shelter, 1 night in, 1 night out. The animal context was unavoidable. A polar bear had been reported along the coast 2 days earlier, moving inland along a frozen river corridor in search of food. In midwinter, when sea ice is unstable or prey is scarce, bears sometimes travel long distances on land, investigating anything that smells like calories. The vulnerability detail was a compromise made under stress. Their snowmobile had struggled in the wind, and they arrived later than planned. Instead of securing all food in the exterior steel cache, located 45 meters from the cabin and partially drifted over, they brought several items inside to deal with in the morning, including a bag containing dried fish and cooking oil. At 3:11 a.m., Amira woke to a sound that didn't fit the generator's rhythm. A slow, deliberate scrape against the cabin's exterior wall, then a heavier bump. Testing. Cole woke as well. They didn't speak at first. In extreme cold, panic wastes oxygen and clarity. Amira reached for the satellite communicator. Cole reached for the flare kit stored near the door, standard for remote winter travel, meant for signaling, not for aggression. The polar bear made contact in a way that felt unreal because of the cabin's smallness. It pushed against the wall near the door, and the entire structure flexed. Snow fell from the ceiling rafters in a fine dust. Wide shot, a single cabin light glowing against horizontal snow, the dark shape pressing close. They heard the bear's breathing through the wall, a deep, steady exhale. Then the smell, faint but unmistakable. Wet fur and cold air. The trigger was sent. The bear wasn't wandering randomly. It had found the cabin because something inside smelled like food, and the wind was carrying that odor into the night. Cole shouted and hit the interior wall with the flat of a shovel handle, making a booming thud. Amira turned on the cabin's exterior floodlight. It flicked on with a weak yellow glow, illuminating blowing snow and a massive white shape close enough that it filled most of the window. The bear's size was later estimated at 450 to 550 kilograms. Large, mature, powerful. It turned its head toward the light, then resumed pushing, as if the cabin were simply an obstacle. Cole cracked the door open just enough to create a narrow angle and fired a flare downward into the snow a few meters away. The flare hissed and burned bright, casting harsh red light across the storm. The bear recoiled, stepping back, blinking, but it did not leave. It circled the cabin, out of sight, then returned to the same wall section, now pushing with more force. The cabin groaned. The door frame shifted slightly, a sign that structural integrity was not guaranteed. Amira activated the satellite communicator and sent an emergency signal at 3:16 a.m. The reply came back quickly. Rescue could not launch until winds dropped below safe flight limits, likely after daylight. That meant hours of holding the cabin. Cole and Amira changed tactics. They moved all food items into the exterior steel cache despite the wind, knowing the risk of exposure, but recognizing the greater risk of keeping attractants inside. Cole clipped a rope to his waist and anchored it inside the cabin. Amira kept the flare kit ready and watched the bear's position through the window. Cole opened the door in a burst, stepped out into the storm, and moved fast. 5 seconds to the cache, 15 seconds to open it with stiff gloves, then back. The wind stole breath immediately. He shoved the food inside the cache and slammed it shut. The bear, momentarily distracted by the flare still burning in the snow, turned toward the new movement. It took 2 steps forward, then hesitated, sniffing the air. The strongest scent had shifted away from the cabin. For the next 10 minutes, the bear moved between the cache area and the cabin perimeter, testing. The storm made the scene feel unreal. Red flare light, weak floodlight, snow moving sideways like smoke. Finally, at 3:31 a.m., the bear turned and walked into the whiteout, following the river corridor back toward the coast, leaving deep tracks that filled almost immediately with blowing snow. They stayed awake until dawn. Rescue arrived by snowmobile convoy at 10:22 a.m. after winds eased, bringing additional deterrence tools and escorting them out. Neither person was injured, but both exhibited mild hypothermia symptoms from the brief exposure during the cache transfer, and both reported lingering anxiety tied to the sound of pressure on walls, and awareness that shelter is sometimes negotiable. Officials later concluded that the presence of high-odor food inside the cabin was the primary attractant, amplified by wind-driven scent dispersal. They recommended strict no-food-in-sleeping shelter policy in polar bear travel zones, improved cache accessibility, raised above drift lines, and pre-planned arrival procedures that don't degrade under fatigue. Key takeaway: in extreme environments, fatigue tempts shortcuts. Keep attractants out of shelter because a strong predator will test the structure until scent cues change. Across all 6 accounts, the pattern is not mystery or bad luck. It's alignment. An attractant, food, waste, or prey-associated scent. An environmental condition that reduces detection. Fog, darkness, wind, snow, mechanical noise, and timing that favors animal movement, dawn, night, seasonal feeding pressure. When those 3 overlap, response time collapses. The difference between a close call and a catastrophe often comes down to simple geometry, clear exits, distance from cover, rigid storage, and the ability to create loud, disruptive signals that break an animal's focus long enough to retreat. Wild animals don't need to be angry to be lethal. They only need to be committed close and operating in conditions where humans see late and react slower. The lesson isn't fear, it's discipline. Manage scent, respect low visibility hours, build escape options into every routine task, and treat infrastructure as neutral, not protective, unless it is designed and maintained to be so.